Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, in part in collaboration with Jane Austen July, but also just to read the whole book aloud. That's always a lot of fun. And we are up to Chapter 9. This will be take number 6, trying to get Chapter 9 read without needing to stop. We'll see if I do it. So we're in Chapter 9, and the story here so far is very simple. Mr. Bingley and a group of his friends and his relatives have camped in Netherfield Hall in proximity to Longbourn, the home of the Bennett family. Mr. Bingley is a wealthy young man. He has other wealthy young people with him. His sisters are high fashion. It's a great jolt of something new for the neighborhood. And it has made all the mamas in the neighborhood hopeful that at least one of the eligible young men involved can be affianced to one of their daughters. This is made especially likely since there are dances and balls and routs so that all these young people can meet each other. And the most successful of those meetings is between Jane Bennett, the oldest daughter of the Bennett family, and Mr. Bingley himself. They are taken with each other right away. The Bennets become friends with the party at Netherfield Hall and are invited. Jane is invited to go ride over there. It's just 3 miles. Go over there on horseback just to visit. But Jane is caught in a rainstorm, and it brings on a cold, a bad cold. She's bedridden. Elizabeth, her younger sister, goes to Netherfield Hall. She tramps across country, so she gets there flushed and muddy, in order to tend to her sister, and sends back word to Longbourn, sends back bulletins to Longbourn. And that's where we are now at Chapter 9. We're going to try, probably doomed, we're going to try to read Chapter 9. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries which she had early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and sometime afterwards by the 2 elegant ladies who waited on his sisters. In spite of this amendment, however, she requested to have a note sent to Longbourn, desiring her mother to visit Jane, and form her own judgments on the situation. The note was immediately dispatched, and its contents as quickly complied with. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her 2 youngest girls, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. And here we have Hugh Thompson's illustrations. There is his illustration. Here we'll pause for the siren. It's actually 3 sirens. Okay, and there comes a point now where I don't care if the house catches fire. So there is the picture that we have there of Mrs. Bennet and her 2 daughters arriving. Had she found Jane in any apparent danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been very miserable. But being satisfied on seeing that her illness was not alarming, she had no wish of her recovering immediately, as her restoration to health would probably remove her from Netherfield. So she has already been informed that her daughter has a bad cold, but she knows that colds aren't going to kill a young person, and the longer that Jane stays at Netherfield, the higher likelihood it is that she and Bingley will cement the relationship that they have formed over various dinners and dances. And she wants that to happen. She would not listen, therefore, to her daughter's proposal of being carried home. In other words, Jane says maybe I should get in the carriage and we should go back to Longbourn. Neither did the apothecary, who arrived about the same time, think it at all advisable. After sitting a while with Jane on Miss Bingley's appearance and invitation, the mother and 3 daughters all attended to her in the breakfast parlor. Bingley met them with hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Miss Bennet worse than she expected. So it's important to understand here that although the narrator wants us to hate Mrs. Bennet and says that she doesn't want her to leave and go home because that would disrupt the proceedings, it would disrupt the grand plan of getting her sunk in at Netherfield, it's important to understand 2 things. One, notice that the narrator says at least allows that Mrs. Bennet would have been miserable if she'd found Jane genuinely ill. That's great. Surprised that we get that much, but that's great. And also, 2, it's important to note that the apothecary himself says it's a bad idea to move her. So it's not just the mother being mercenary. Indeed I have, sir, was her answer. She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says that we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness. Removed, cried Bingley. It must not be thought of. My sister, I am sure, will not hear of her removal. You may depend upon it, madam, said Miss Bingley with cold civility, that Miss Bennet shall receive every possible attention while she remains with us. Mrs. Bennet was profuse in her acknowledgments. I am sure, she added, if it was not for such good friends, I would not know what would become of her, for she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, though with the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her, for she has, without exception, the sweetest temper I ever met with. I often tell my other girls that they are nothing to her. You have a sweet room here, Miss Bingley, and a charming prospect over that gravel walk. I do not know a place in the country that is equal to Netherfield. You will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease. Whatever I do is done in a hurry, replied he, and therefore if I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself quite fixed here. Of course he's not, as we're going to see, he's not. That is exactly what I should have supposed of you, said Elizabeth. You begin to comprehend me, do you? Cried he, turning towards her. Oh, yes, I understand you perfectly. I wish I might take that for a compliment, but to be so easy seen through, I am afraid, is pitiful. That is as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours. Lizzie, cried her mother, remember where you are, and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to do at home. I did not know before, continued Bingley immediately, that you were a studier of character. It must be an amusing study. Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage. The country, said Darcy. No wonder he speaks up now. She's probably looking at him when she makes a mention of intricate characters. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighborhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society. But people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. That's Elizabeth speaking up on behalf of the village of St. Mary Mead. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighborhood. I assure you there is quite as much going on in the country as in town. Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued in her triumph. I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country, for my part, except the shops and public places. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley? When I am in the country, replied he, I never wish to leave it, and when I am in town, it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages. I can be equally happy in either. Hear, hear, Mr. Bingley. And that is because you have right disposition, but that gentleman, looking at Darcy, seemed to think the country was nothing at all. Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken, said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there were not such a variety of people to be met with in the country as in town, which you must acknowledge to be true. Certainly, my dear, nobody said there were, but as not meeting with many people in this neighborhood, I believe there are few neighborhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families. Nothing but concern for Elizabeth could enable Bingley to keep his countenance, because Mrs. Bingley is being a little bit idiotic here. She's doing what parents want, at least one parent in most families gets very skilled at doing. She is coming out with malapropisms. We know what she means, but nevertheless, it's not what she says, and what she says is ridiculous. She's estimating the size of the country by how many people they dine out with. His sister was less delicate, and directed her eye toward Mr. Darcy with a very expressive smile. Elizabeth, for the sake of saying something that might turn her mother's thoughts, now asked her if Charlotte Lucas had been to Longbourn since her coming away. Yes, she called yesterday with her father. What an agreeable man Sir William is, Mr. Bingley, is he not? So much the man of fashion, so genteel and easy. He has always something to say to everybody. That is my idea of good breeding, and those persons who fancy themselves very important and never open their mouths quite mistake the matter. Again, this is all directed at Darcy. She hates Darcy. She is not let up on him. Did Charlotte dine with you? This is Elizabeth desperately trying to turn the subject. No, she would go home. I fancy she was wanted about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that can do their own work. My daughters were brought up very differently. But everybody is to judge for themselves, and the Lucases are very good sort of girls, I assure you. It is a pity that they are not handsome. Not that I think Charlotte so very plain, but then she is our particular friend. So Mrs. Bennett is just making things worse. That Charlotte Lucas was called home because she has to help with the mince pies, that all the Lucas girls are plain, but we like Charlotte, so we don't call her. It's all just awful. And also, we're going to learn later on in the book that Mrs. Bennett doesn't have anything to crow about in how her daughters were raised. Not at all. She seems a very pleasant young woman, said Bingley. Oh, dear, yes, but you must own she's very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so, and envied me Jane's beauty. I do not like to boast of my own child, but to be sure, Jane, one does not often see anybody better looking. It is what everybody says. I do not trust my own partiality. When she was only 15, there was a gentleman at my brother Gardner's house in town, so much in love with her that my sister-in-law was sure he would make her an offer before we came away. But however, he did not. Perhaps he thought her too young. However, he wrote some verses on her, and very pretty they were. And so ended his affection, said Elizabeth impatiently. There has been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love. Very interesting story. What is this story of Jane's first romance? Who is this guy? I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love, said Darcy, referring here to Shakespeare, of course. If poetry be the food of love, play on. And notice also, when Bingley talks about loving the country when he's in the country and loving the city when he's in the city, if that's not an allusion to Horace, I don't know what is. But anyway, of a fine, stout, healthy love it may be. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away. Very non-romantic view of things from Elizabeth Bennet. Darcy only smiled, and the general pause which ensued made Elizabeth tremble lest her mother should be exposing herself again. She longed to speak, but could think of nothing to say, and after a short silence, Mrs. Bennet began repeating her thanks to Mr. Bingley for his kindness to Jane, and with an apology for troubling him also about Lizzie. That sounds very nice. Sounds very courteous and friendly. It doesn't sound like anything you need to worry about. Mr. Bingley was unaffectedly civil in his answer, and forced his younger sister to be civil also, and say what the occasion required. She performed her part indeed without much graciousness, but Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon afterwards ordered her carriage. Upon this signal, the youngest of her daughters put herself forward. The two girls had been whispering to each other during the whole visit, and the result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield. Catherine and Lydia don't care about that their sister is sick. They don't care about any of the niceties. They don't care about anything. They're young poppets. They're young imbeciles. They just care about dashing young men in uniform, about balls and dances and whatnot. Why their mother brought them along, I have no idea. Since she doesn't want any of them to know Mr. Darcy and wants no interference between Mr. Bingley and Jane. I don't know why. I would love to have seen that scene. It's another example where I wish that Pride and Prejudice were 800 pages long. I would love Jane Austen to write the scene where the note comes to Longbourn, and there's a flurry, and they have to decide who's going to go. Obviously, Mrs. Bennet can't go alone. And apparently, it's never even thought of that Mary would go. I would love to have seen that scene, but it turns out that the two younger girls had ulterior motives and have just been impatiently waiting until the end, until their mother called for their carriage for them to go. Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humored countenance, a favorite with her mother, whose affection had brought her into public at an early age. She had high animal spirits and a sort of natural self-consequence, which the attention of the officers, to whom her uncle's good dinners and her own easy manners recommended her, had increased into assurance. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise, adding that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. His answer to this sudden attack was delightful to their mother's ear. I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement, and when your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball. But you would not wish to be dancing while she is ill. Lydia declared herself satisfied. Oh, yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane is well, and by that time, most likely, Captain Carter would be at Meryton again. And when you've given your ball, she added, I shall insist on their giving one also. I shall tell Colonel Forster it shall be quite a shame if he does not. She doesn't really care that Jane is ill. The timing is good to get those officers back. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behavior to the remarks of the two ladies and of Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed upon to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. So that is the chapter, and not only are we being told that Darcy cannot be drawn into mocking the Bennets at all. But we were also told in that sally that Elizabeth gave, and Jane Austen does very little in the way of stage direction, so you really have to read between the lines yourself if you want to, and the lines can be read between many different ways. I think all her comments about intricate personalities were aimed at Darcy and said looking at Darcy. But whether they were or not, they provoked a smile from him, which not everything does. So we don't get that conversation, but we have now had a visit from Mrs. Bennet to Netherfield Hall, and it wasn't quite a disaster. Yes, she comes out with some malapropisms. They're fairly innocent, and I might add, they're bracketed on all sides by social niceties. We are told that she would have been grieved if she'd found her daughter seriously ill. We are told that she effusively thanks Mr. Bingley and all of his party for their hospitality. It's true that she goes a little bit out of her way to put Mr. Darcy in his place, but she ends her visit with moral courtesies, with more thanking everybody involved. That is delightful. I thought it's a sparkling, delightful chapter. So we'll move on the next time, when I'm hoping that I will only need one take and that it will be a full 30 degrees cooler. But who knows? We'll forge on anyway. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.